Tonight is part 2 of a 4-part series discussing the Branch Creek Regenerative Turf System. This is a system that has been engineered to build soil, reduce impacts of pesticides, and actually put carbon, which is a component of greenhouse gases, back in the soil where it came from. Now, I don't know where this group stands on climate change, but if you believe that there's something happening, something going on, wouldn't it be great if you were running a turf system that was built to sequester carbon and that may have the ability to slow or reduce climate change? Now, this webinar that we're going to be doing tonight has been sponsored by Terra. Barry Draycott is representing Terra here tonight. Terra is a supplier of natural and organic products for tree and turf care professionals. Good evening, Barry.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm doing very well. Hey, Barry, last week we focused on one of your favorite topics. We talked about soils. So could you kind of briefly review what we discussed last week for the people who may have missed the program?
Sure, I'd be glad to, Mike. You know, usually when I talk about soils, I'm focusing on the microorganisms that are in the soil, the bacteria, fungi, and everything. And then all of these organisms plus earthworms, they make what's called the soil food web. And the interactions between the soil biology and the plants is pretty much what drives everything. You know, plants, they take sunlight and CO2 from the atmosphere and they turn it into sugars and put that down through their roots, and that feeds the microbes down there, and the microbes in turn help feed the plants directly. They reduce disease pressures. They improve the soil structure and retention of nutrients. So that's usually what I talk about, and I'm just going to take a minute or two to go a little different direction, because soil, beyond that, it's probably the most important thing on top of the ground or part of the ground that drives our entire ecosystem. So, you know, we depend on food from soil, our water regulation, clean water. Soil plays a huge part in that. And soil reduces a lot of contaminations, and it sequesters carbon. So quality of soil, it defines its ability to provide these services. And drastically, unfortunately, in many locations throughout the world, due to human activities, the soil has lost a lot of their qualities due to degradation, erosion, and desertification. And there's a severe and imposing risk on the growing human population. So it's important that we are aware of protecting soils and understand that the same process of how to build it up and regenerate the soil. So soil holds the largest portion of active carbon on Earth, and plants take carbon from the air and convert it into the plant tissue, and some of that returns to the soil as plant residue. So soil carbon sequestration, that's the process where the CO2 is removed from the atmosphere and stored in the soil. And that's primarily the basic positive effect soil can have on how we can positively affect our ecosystem.
Thanks, Barry.
I'll just finish with one last sentence that I always like to put in there. Everything is connected to everything else.
I agree. I think one of the biggest challenges facing us right now in the turf care industry, in the ornamental industry, and the green industry for that matter, is the fact that a lot of our soils have been urbanized and are very depleted in organic matter, very depleted in biology. And one of the things that we need to do is build our soil back. And that's one of the key components of a Branch Creek Regenerative Turf System. It really is all about building that soil. So thanks, Barry. Appreciate that quick recap. Let's take a deeper dive into some of the components that we use when building a Branch Creek Regenerative Turf System. So let me introduce you to our first panelist or guest, Carl Cemente from the Cornell Turf Research Program. Good evening, Carl. How are you?
Hey, Mike. I'm doing well. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me on today.
No, appreciate you coming. I appreciate you coming. You want to give us a little bit of background about yourself? How did you get started in turf?
Yeah, so actually, my background. So I went to Cornell University, graduated in 2014 with an environmental engineering degree. But while I was in school, because I played golf on the Cornell golf team and had an interest in golf, I hooked up with Professor Frank Rossi, who's a turfgrass professor at Cornell, and basically did a couple internships for him during the summers, working on his research plots, just maintaining the plots, mowing, kind of keeping things in order. So after a couple years out of college, I actually tried professional golf for a couple years down in Florida, but after I gave that a go, I came back to Ithaca and just randomly actually saw Frank one day up near the golf course. And he asked me, hey, Carl, I'm looking for somebody to work with golf courses on reducing pesticide use. And we've got this program that he was working on and we're still working on with the New York State Park golf courses. He said, hey, I think I can teach you turf. I want to use your engineering background, specifically with kind of data and looking at models. And I want you to see if you can do this. And that was, over 4 years ago. And so since then, I've built out a lot of my turf knowledge, outside of just this pesticide risk reduction work that we're going to talk about today. But this is the stuff I get to talk about today is really where I started in the turf industry and where I started with golf courses, but now it's making its way into other turf systems, which is really great to see.
So tonight you're going to be really, one of our focuses is going to be EIQ, or the environmental impact quotient. So what is it and how does it fit with an IPM approach? Yeah,
so here's actually the definition. The original paper was written in 1992 by a couple of Cornell scientists, and quite basically, it's a method to measure the environmental impact of pesticides. And what does that mean? What it does, this model spits out a number, and it spits out a number that is going to gauge how environmentally impactful that pesticide application was. So any pesticide you have, you can type in a couple of things on this online calculator, it'll spit out a number. And what you can do with this EIQ is you can look at your pesticide program and you can say, okay, how can I reduce my environmental impact? So traditionally, when we kind of have measured pesticide use, we've measured it through something like pounds on the ground, so pounds of active ingredient you've applied. And we don't really consider kind of what products you applied. We just said, okay, you applied X number of pounds this year, why don't you reduce that next year? Or you applied this many applications to a lawn or a golf course, why don't we try and reduce that? And that's one way to go about it. But what the EIQ does is it considers two main components. And because it's a risk assessment model, and this is any risk assessment model, we'll consider both the hazard and the exposure. So the hazard is, if I have two products and one is, very soft, it doesn't do much when in its trials, they test it on mice or fish or whatever, and it's not, we're not seeing many negative effects there. Let's say I got product B, and that is really just a little tiny bit of it will adversely affect, mammals or birds or bees. So that's what we're considering hazard, toxicity really. How toxic is the product? And then the exposure is how likely is that product to get to that organism? Is it going to get into the systems of the bees? Is it going to reach the water to impact the fish? So it's not just looking at, okay, how many pounds did you apply? It's looking at a bunch of data that's required when these pesticides get certified through the EPA. Okay, we've got all this data, why don't we make use of it? And then it's also saying, okay, so we've got all this toxicity data, but we also got to figure out if the product, if that pesticide is going to reach an organism and potentially give it an adverse effect. So, I'm not going to explain this equation, and this is a lot of numbers, and this brings us back to, algebra, and, bad memories of calculus in college for me. But I just wanted to point out here the aspects of toxicity that this model considers. So this is the EIQ equation. It spits out one number, and it considers all of these factors down here. So we see things like dermal toxicity, fish toxicity, birds, bees. So we take that data and we put those into numbers and we plug them into this equation and it spits out a number. Now you can also see things like leaching potential or surface loss potential. So those are the exposure routes. So within this model, we've got these two things coming together, the hazard and the exposure, and we're giving it a number. And that allows us to take all this information into one number that can be something we can make decisions on. So, you know, from that aspect, it's a really simple way to look at risk. But the important thing is, you know, when do we use the EIQ? And this is, you know, basic IPM pyramid. I learned this from Jennifer Grant, who's one of my mentors, is since retired, but, you know, really one of the people I learned a lot from. And she really stressed this pyramid. We don't have enough time tonight to go through all these basic building blocks that you're going to go through before you get to the EIQ, right? You want to have, do I have the right turf species around? Are my soils physically and biologically functioning? You know, I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but where the EIQ comes in is, you know, let's say you've tried all of these things and you still have a pest problem. Let's say crabgrass. Okay, I've reached the point where I can't do anything about that crabgrass unless I apply a chemical. That's where we use the EIQ. So it's going to be a decision-making tool. Once we've gone through all of these other practices we can employ, once I get to the stage I got to intervene with chemicals, this EIQ is going to be something that helps us in the decision-making process. So, you know, the other thing I wanted to touch on is the EIQ is not the thing alone that's going to help us choose a pesticide, right? But the first thing you want to do is you want to choose a pesticide that works. As someone in academics, we look at a lot of the research behind, you know, certain products, testing them on, you know, in golf, we look a lot with diseases and fungicides. But of course, you guys have, you know, insects and weed problems, which are first and foremost for you guys. This is a resource I use all the time. It's a resource from Wisconsin, and they've distilled down all this research on pest issues, on weeds, insects, diseases. You can see it right here. And you can literally just go through, click, all right, I've got a turf weed issue. Let me see. And let's use the example of crabgrass. Well, you can go down and select crabgrass, click enter. And what it's going to do is it's going to give us a list of products that have crabgrass on the label. And what it does, it has this rating thing. And this is an efficacy rating. So based on all these research trials, you know, anything with a 4 is really good control. If we scroll down here, okay, there's some with 3s, so not quite as great control, right? We've got 2s, we've got 1s, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, when I've got a crabgrass issue, you know, I'm going to go to this website and I'm going to say, okay, what works for crabgrass? And we see a couple things, you know, dimension, some classic ones in here, and they all have 4s, right? So, okay, I could pick any one of these chemicals, and I know I'm going to be pretty safe in assuming that these are going to work. This is where the EIQ comes in. Now, of course, you got to consider cost too, but I want to consider, okay, so all of these work, but which one's going to be the lowest? It's going to have the lowest impact on the environment. Which one's going to have the lowest EIQ?
So when you're looking at pesticides, I've always used what I call the 3 E's. I look at efficacy, I look at economics, and then I look at environmental. And so what you're saying is that we've taken 2 of those components and used it using this system right here from the University of Wisconsin. That's going to give us our efficacy. And then the environmental, that's something that we'll get out of EIQ. And economics, we can figure out by just saying, well, what's our cost?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know, in the past, I think the environmental component is something that maybe you could look at the label. So, you know, we all know caution, warning, danger, there's those labels, and those are okay. Those are okay at kind of evaluating the risk of a pesticide application. But they really only look at, you know, 1 or 2, a lot of those mammalian toxicity values. The EIQ has 11 factors it considers. So I like that we're considering more toxicity data, kind of a broader toxicity data set than those labels are based on. So, and then it gives you a number. It can say, okay, this pesticide is lower than this pesticide. So, you know, okay, let's say I go in here, I get my efficacy. I can go to now the EIQ calculator. So I've pulled up, just the New York State IPM runs this website, and they've done all that big formula with all those, you know, data points. The New York State IPM offices houses a database of all those EIQ values. So you can just go in here. Let's say I wanted to look at dimension, right? Or sorry, dithiopyr. I can select it. I can put in, information about the product, the rate I use the product at. That's important because, again, it's an exposure element, right? So if I use a higher rate or lower rate, that's going to affect the EIQ. And when you end up getting is you can make a table. And actually, Mike, you made this table, right? So this is a table of products. And I love what Mike's done here. He said, okay, I've got some pest issues, pretty main ones, right? Dandelion, crabgrass, grubs. And he's gone through, he's found some products that are labeled for those, but also have efficacy. He went in through the Wisconsin database and found products that have good efficacy. And then he went in and he compared those EIQ values and he said, okay, look, if we take this crabgrass example, dimension and dithiopyrin pendimethalin both work well for crabgrass, but look at the difference in the EIQ. So 60 versus 6. Those numbers are just relative, but what it tells you is dimension is a lot lower than pendimethalin in terms of EIQ. So we call that a softer product. Again, you look at stuff like grub control, Dialox, trichlorophon is a very high, we'd say a high risk active ingredient. So it's a very high EIQ ingredient. Compared to this clothianidin, it's much higher. So when you're making those decisions, the EIQ comes in and really allows you to pick. In some cases here, I know Mike, you've got some reduction impact numbers. That's a great way to do it. This product, I call it product swapping, is a really easy way to reduce your impact on the environment. Just looking at this EIQ model.
No, I have to tell you, the EIQ was a game changer for me, because in the past I've been asked by customers, especially in New Jersey, because there's a school IPM program, that you have to use the least toxic solution first. And the problem was always, we could only use caution, warning, danger. And that gave us a general guideline. But then if you elevated the rate of a product, it could actually turn out to be more of from a caution could go to a warning, or from a warning to a danger if you weren't careful. So this helped me make better decisions, or help my customers make better decisions. And then we're using this EIQ plus the Wisconsin turf pest portal to kind of use it to build our Branch Creek Regenerative Turf System, because we wanted to make sure that when we put together a program, it was gonna work the way people want it to work. People want green grass that's weed free, but in the past we have failed because we've gone in a direction maybe too far and tried to reduce pesticide use and then didn't get the efficacy as they desired. So we compared this using the EIQ and the efficacy. We've actually taken a program and reduced it by 88%. A Branch Creek Regenerative Turf System has an 88% reduction of impact when we compare it to other synthetic programs. So I find that to be just exciting.
And it's important to mention, Mike, I think, when I first got into looking at the EIQ, I just assumed, okay, lower EIQ products or softer products are not going to work as well. And then I did a lot of research, a lot of golf products, fungicides, and was looking around, and I plotted all these fungicides on graphs, EIQ versus efficacy, and I was like, oh, there's really no relationship. And so what that means is, just because a product is low EIQ does not mean it doesn't work. And just because a product is high EIQ does not mean it works well. And all these products have certain situations where you can use them in. So I don't want to discourage any product, but when you've dialed in a pest like you have here, you've identified some main pests, you've gone through, you've looked at products that work, efficacy, obviously you've considered cost, and then this EIQ, this environmental component, that last E. This is exactly what we recommend with a lot of golf courses, and it's really good to see you guys and the lawn and ornamentals industry start using this. Seeing it in ag, a lot of ag companies now getting in touch with us about it too. So it's good to see it branching out a little bit and people using the data. There's a lot of data there, and we're happy that the people are finally looking at it.
Yeah. Earlier today, when we were having a conversation, you had mentioned that you've got actually data points that show how EIQ has affected golf over a certain amount of years and where it was trending.
Yep. So
can you share that?
Yeah. So we've worked. So Frank Rossi, who's my advisor here at Cornell, and Jennifer Grant, who's recently retired, they've worked with the New York State Park golf course system, about 15 golf courses for almost 20 years. And we've got data actually since 2010, so 10 years now, where we've gotten the pesticide programs from all those golf courses every year, and we calculated EIQ. And each year we do kind of a winter training with the superintendents, and we talk about EIQ and certain pest issues. And golf courses up here, dollar spot is the main disease we treat. About 50% of our EIQ is, on a given year, is designated towards treating dollar spot. And then annual bluegrass weevil, ABW, is another 30%. So those two pests make up about 80% of our pesticide applications on New York golf courses. So we said over in the last 10 years, we've developed a bunch of ways, and we go back to this pyramid. A lot of these bottom three, right, those fundamentals, we've tried to harp on. Okay, you can do these things to prevent these pests, but also one thing that's helped is just product swapping, and especially on large areas of turf, so fairways, rough areas where it's 20, 30 acres. If you're going to spray those areas, why don't we choose products that are lower EIQ? And really, that has been the key. And we've seen steady declines. We're at about half of what our peak was in 2012, was the peak of EIQ for those state park golf courses, but it's continually decreased since then. And a lot of that is due to their understanding of the EIQ, and that when applied over a large area, and a lot of you guys who are out there with a lot of properties, that adds up. So if we're looking at this sheet right here, dimension versus pendimethalin, let's say you got 20 acres or 40 acres or whatever it is of property, that adds up to a lot of percentage decrease in your environmental impact. So on our golf courses, that's what we've seen. And in the lawn care industry, I think people who service a lot of properties have a lot of potential to reduce their environmental impact just by choosing products that are softer.
So we could have a nice cumulative effect because of the turf and ornamental far outweighs the acreages that are being by pesticides in golf. I mean, it's night and day difference. So I want to just talk about it again. I think you said since 2012, the peak, you've seen about a 50% reduction in golf courses for EIQ. And we're not talking these hard scrabble, bad, nasty courses. We're talking quality courses. Like, isn't one of the courses Beth Page?
Beth Page Black. I don't, it may have hosted the PGA Championship last year. One of its lowest EIQ years. When it hosted the PGA Championship. So yeah, that's a good point, Mike. I forget to mention, these state park golf courses aren't just kind of your run of the mill places. We've got some high standards: Montauk Downs, Beth Page Black, Green Lakes up here in Syracuse. These are courses that have a lot of history and are maintained pretty well, and those guys are still really tuned into this EIQ and understanding their environmental impact when they're managing those landscapes.
Yeah, I have no problem dropping names like Beth Page, something that important. So thank you. Carl, really, I appreciate it. Hopefully you'll be able to stay with us until the end, and there may be some questions for you at the end. So Carl, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Our next panelist is going to be Nate Clemmer, who's the CEO of Branch Creek Organics. Good evening, Nate.
Good evening, Mike. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Tonight's virtual door prize is that 25-pack Branch Creek soil health test. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about Branch Creek soil health test.
Yeah, I can do that. I think, recognizing that it's 7:30 and wanting to be done, as much as possible at 30 minutes, which is what we committed to people. I think maybe we push that to next week, Mike, if that's okay with you.
That's absolutely perfect. Let's push that to next week. We'll add that onto our schedule for next week. So then if that's the case, before we open the floor to questions.
But if I can just jump in on one thing related to EIQ, I think it's really important
Of course.
to bring this up because, I think we got to be really careful when we talk about these things regarding a regenerative turf system. Can you see my screen, Mike?
Yes, I can.
So the EIQ, Mike Reed mentioned it's a game changer. Well, why is it a game changer? Like, what's the significance? So if you remember in last week's presentation, I talked about how we got to change the way we demonize the word pesticide, right? Like, we have a tendency as a society to say pesticide means skull and crossbones. It really doesn't. And we talked about this last week, where based upon the EPA's definition, a pesticide is any way we control a pest. We talked about salt, table salt. On my fries, it's delicious. On a slug marketed as slug control, it's a pesticide. So we got to be really, really, really careful. And I think when we use these words like organic and we just X out pesticides, I don't think we're really thinking as a society. Pesticides can be a problem. On the slide that was shown previously, we talked about dithiopyr versus pendimethalin. There's not too many lawn care operators using pendimethalin. But guess what Scott's pre-emergent is for every bag of pre-emergent that's sold through a Home Depot, Lowe's, whatever? It's pendimethalin. So these are big problems that manifest themselves in EIQ. And so when we were trying to develop this regenerative turf system, recognizing that in the lawn care industry, all of you who are lawn care operators compete with people who are more interested in spinning the truth than they are in actually being honest and delivering their customers what they want. That's the reality. We knew we had to find higher ground in which people with integrity could stand. And so one of my goals is to educate customers, commercial building owners, homeowners on EIQ. And if 5 years from now, 3 lawn care companies are presenting a homeowner with their plan for their lawn, I want that homeowner to say, what's my EIQ score going to be on this? And then make decisions based upon that. Because I think that's where we need to get to as an industry. And so with the regenerative turf system, again, we're not anti-pesticide, but we're going to make sure that we're using the pesticides that have the lowest impact, human, planet, pet. And we found EIQ to be the best way for us to measure that. So I just want to make sure we tie that together. I think it's really important, the regenerative turf system. Again, not anti-pesticide, just trying to reduce the toxicity as much as possible. And EIQ gives us, a way to monitor that. So I just want to make sure I mention that. We can talk about the regenerative, the Branch Creek Soil Health Score next week, if that's okay with you, Mike. That's all
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not a problem with that. So let's now open it up for questions. Okay, hold on. We've got a question from Josiah to everyone. And his question is, how do these practices work in the South? They work equally the same in the South as they do in the North, because EIQ for the North and the South are going to be the same. Our current regenerative turf care system that we have out there right now is truly built for cool season grasses, but we've been developing one for warm season grasses as well. So stay tuned. We should have something up and running for the spring for warm season grasses. Thank you for that question.
Mike, I can jump in and also just say about the EIQ. The EIQ is universal, and I think you mentioned that. It applies to, and it actually doesn't even apply just to turf systems. It applies to agriculture, anywhere you're applying a pesticide. So you don't have to worry about if you're in the South or North or overseas or anything like that. It's a general way to quantify pesticide risk.
All right, so we have Gary West who asked, what are effective usable EIQ scores? Do we just use the least score with the best efficacy, or do you have a cutoff score? And if so, what numbers would you stay away from? Well, Gary, my answer, and I'll let Carl answer it too. Our goal is to get as close to 0 as possible, but sometimes based upon efficacy, we may have to take something that has a higher score than we want. So I think, Carl, you're going to say if we can keep it below 20, you're comfortable with that number?
I like, so I like, if you start seeing field use EIQ numbers over 100, we start considering that high risk. That's a high risk product. 50 to 100 is still kind of medium high for us. 20 to 50 is kind of in that medium to average-ish pesticide score, I'd say. And then once you get below 20, I'm considering that soft. So, we don't have, and we probably should publish something about, generally high, medium, and low EIQ scores, but that's based on a lot of the data I've looked at. Anything under 20 is doing really well. Anything over 100 is high risk.
Okay. Josiah just jumped on and said, will the EIQ resource be made available? I would like to start using the EIQ method. Actually, Josiah, what we can do is Barry has everyone's email from tonight, and he can send you the link. It's free. It's public access. It's ready to rock. And as long as you can work the calculator, put in the product, the active ingredient, and the rate you're going to use it, it will generate a number.
Mike, Mike Reed, if I can make a suggestion, maybe
Yep.
you want to think about sending out that spreadsheet where you did the math already. And I think Carl's put some eyeballs on that. I
Yeah.
just know from my own experience, I think the calculator is pretty easy, but I don't have a Cornell degree in mathematics. So like, I always question whether I did it right. So like that might help others who wanted to look things up, not have to do the brain work.
Yeah, not a problem. I can do that. I can do that. So we have a question right now from Dave Cavella. It says the Wisconsin site is good for researching pesticide options. Are there any other good sites similar to Wisconsin? And so I'm going to kick that over to Carl, because Carl introduced me to the Wisconsin one. And so maybe Carl's got some other pointers he can share.
Yeah, Dave, that's a great question. And the Wisconsin one is the only one I'm aware of that is that has the data right there. You can search it. And a lot of times what's happened over, basically every year, every 2 years, turf scientists will release a document, and there'll be one for diseases, and it'll be a disease control for turf grasses. And they'll have all these diseases, and they'll have all the products they've tested with all these efficacy ratings, those 4, 3, 1 things. And we've got turf ones for weeds. Aaron Patton at Purdue does this weed specific one. And there's data kind of lingering around from all these research projects for insects. But the Wisconsin site is good because they've aggregated all of that. And it's the only place where they've aggregated it user friendly. You don't have to buy the manual and look through, page it through. Okay, I'm going to crabgrass. Here it is. And the great thing about the Wisconsin website is you can choose 3 weeds if you want. You can say crabgrass, dandelion, plantain. And it'll give you products that will treat all of those or some combination of those, and it'll add the efficacy up for you. It's a really cool tool. It's the only one out there that I'm aware of. I'm not sure if there's anything warm season wise down in the South, but the Wisconsin one's so unique. It's so user friendly. It's a great resource for that.
Thank you, Carl. This
Dave,
question I'm sorry.
Saw that other question from Dave. The insecticide ratings. So that's another good one, Dave. The insecticide data, they don't rate efficacy like they do with, and part of that is getting consistent insect pressure in these tests is harder than getting, say, dollar spot pressure or crabgrass pressure. So they can't quantify it as well. But so that is, one thing with the insect pests on that Wisconsin website, you may not see the number. And so then every once in a while, you might consider searching around for some of that research. The Rutgers guys are great with that. Penn State, there's data gaps and that happens, but sooner or later, I think we'll get numbers on there eventually.
Yeah, and Dave, we're lucky enough that we both live in Jersey, and so we have Rutgers in our state, and there's a good group of people there that you can ask questions to if you don't know what the best product of choice is, and they'll tell you this is what we've seen in New Jersey, or if you live in Pennsylvania, you can go to Penn State and they'll share with you what they've seen the best results are, and then you can take that information, use it to decide, okay, from an efficacy standpoint, this is what we want to use, and then plug the numbers right into the EIQ calculator.
Right.
This
one thing I'd like bring up just real quick is that once you start working with the soil biology and getting carbon to the soil, you have reduced disease pressures tremendously. Most people who have gone that route after a couple of years, they don't really get turf diseases anymore.
Yeah, I'm going to say that I found that to be true on a lot of residential properties, but dollar spot still is cranking in golf courses just because it's finely maintained turf. But yeah, on residential lawns, I'm going to agree with you 100%, Barry. I've seen a lot of disease pressure reduced just because we start balancing the soil biology. Carl, can you speak to that? Have you seen that have a positive effect when you've built soil?
I can't say I've worked too much with, kind of that carbon soil building. I know of, so here's what I will say. is we've had our soil ecologist Kyle Wickings here at Cornell has done studies about on fungicide use on golf course fairways, and he's looked at the soil biological communities on basically a high pesticide program, every 14 days, a low one, and a no pesticide program. And what he found is the high pesticide program decreases diversity of soil biological communities. It also decreases the decomposer community, so that the nitrogen decomposer community. So if you have thatch, you're not going to degrade that as well. If you're on a high EIQ program, that's only the real only experience I've got looking at data on kind of the biological versus and pesticide use. But it's pretty clear from the data I've seen that the pesticides will alter that community. And as Barry's saying, if you can build kind of a more resilient soil, so I say soil building is again that pyramid. If you can have good functioning soils, drainage, they have enough organic matter to sustain and be resilient, you're going to have a better chance of not having to apply pesticides. That's just plain and simple. Soil is the key to reducing a lot of these pest issues.
So we have another question up. It comes from W, and it says, have you ever seen a pesticide with a 0 EIQ?
It's so here's what I will say. There's no every pesticide that the New York State IPM office evaluates is going to have some form of EIQ, and actually there's a minimum EIQ 6.7. If you go back and look at all those factors, those 11 factors have I listed, they basically get rated a 1, 3, or 5 based on their data and plugged into that equation. So if you rate them all at a 1, you're still going to get a 6.7 base EIQ value. So there's not going to be a 0 EIQ pesticide out there. That's the 0 EIQ pesticide is not applying a pesticide. But I will say we do have new active ingredients that have just recently kind of come to market. The New York State IPM office might not have reviewed. So if anyone is going through that calculator and they can't find an active ingredient, that means we just haven't reviewed it yet. And a good thing to do is just shoot me an email if you ever come by that, and we can get someone on looking at the data and evaluating that. So, but no, there's no 0 EIQ pesticide out there.
So our next question is from Josiah, and he says, how do you do that soil building? And actually, we're going to address that next week. And we actually have a guest coming up next week. His name is Peter Pedreza. He's the golf course superintendent of the Crestmont Country Club in West Orange. And he's going to share to you how he's been building soil over the years. And he's actually reduced his fertilizer needs to 0, which to me is actually remarkable. Think about that. A high-end country club that doesn't apply fertilizer and their grass is green and growing well just because they've improved the soil to a point where it functioning gets its own nitrogen source out of the atmosphere and off of plant residue. So I think that's pretty exciting. And Josiah, we're going to be talking about that next week, as well as deconstructing a Branch Creek Regenerative Soil Program, a Branch Creek Regenerative Turf System. And so we can show you how we built it using all these components, EIQ, the Wisconsin efficacy, looking at building soil as a way to improve the performance of the lawn as a whole. So that's kind of a teaser for next week. We've got another one from Josiah saying, I don't think I get this information here in Georgia. We'll work with you in Georgia. Josiah, maybe I can work with you directly on something like that with Barry as we talk about it. Do we have any more questions? If you had a 0 EIQ and you are not using pesticides, would that be organic? Carl, that's up to you.
That's a no. So organic pesticides have EIQs too, and so what I will say is I've seen organic products, fungicides that have actually really high EIQ, and the reason is because of the exposure component. So when I was talking about hazard and exposure, those two risk things that make up risk. A lot of organic products have low EIQ, but they're applied at higher rates. So I know of fungicides in the golf community that are applied 8 ounces per 1,000. So we're talking about, pounds per acre of active ingredient. And so the exposure is really high in a lot of cases of those organic products. Not all cases, but so basically the answer is no. And sometimes organic options are higher EIQ than synthetic options. And I think Nate and Mike, you might have seen some of that when you've gone in through EIQ, and that's one of the things that was surprising. When the EIQ was invented, a lot of organic apple growers were not happy because they were using copper. And guess what? Copper is not only has some hazard to it, but there was a lot of at high rates, high EIQ, even though it's organic. So it's important to consider all that toxicity information.
And it's all the more reason why the organic language in turf really just confuses rather than helps. Because we talked about this last week, there is no such thing as organic lawn care maintenance. Like when certified organic, which when Carl says organic, we're talking certified organic, and that's set based upon agricultural guidelines, not for people's grass. And it's assuming it's a food crop where people are going to eat the crop. When we talk about grass, what I'll call the case study, the backdrop is totally different, but it's a perfect example of where we tried to take something in agriculture and overlay it with turf. And it was more, let's be honest, it was driven by marketing more so than agronomics and environmental. Was it better than what we were doing? Sure. Is it ultimately the end goal? I really don't believe so. And I think that's where the regenerative turf system is really where we need to be getting, where it's about toxicity. It's not about, whether something is labeled certified organic or not.
Oh, Richard, I'm reading your question again. I think I maybe misinterpreted it. So you're asking if you don't use any pesticides, would that be considered organic? I guess if you're not using any synthetic fertilizers, I guess you could consider it organic. But as Nate's saying, the term organic doesn't, I wouldn't say it means across the board really good. I mean, sometimes organic can be less preferable from an EIQ perspective than non-organic. So I know organic's a great way to sell, I'm sure, to customers, but I think I'm interested more in the impacts of the products you use in your management systems than calling it organic or not. I'd just like it to be sustainable, and it's hard to put a label on that, but if you use EIQ and you're using a lot of these responsible IPM practices, I think that's something you can say.
So let's say this. Any more questions, folks? Actually, really good questions tonight. I'm happy. Josiah, we're going to hand this over to you. It's yours, Carl. I'm going to just sit back and listen.
Yes, Josiah, great point. So again, we're going through that. So Josiah asks, is spot spraying weeds better than broadcast spraying? And because you are using less product, so let's say you got 4,000 square feet of lawn, and instead you could just spot spray that lawn, let's say 100 square feet. Because you've reduced the amount of pesticide you used about, what is my math? About less than 1%, you've reduced your EIQ by a ton. And just by spraying less area, you reduce the exposure component of risk, and therefore you reduce your EIQ. So you could reduce EIQ a bunch of ways. Tonight we talked about product swapping, so swapping one product in, a lower, softer product, but you could also just cut your acreage in half. You could spray only the front yard if it's south facing and it's the only place that has crabgrass, or you could spot spray. And that's another great way to reduce EIQ, is to just not spray it everywhere, just spray it a couple places. So great question.
There's a lot of EIQ consumed in what I'll call production lawn care because we don't want to go back. We don't think we're afraid it's going to hurt our economics as a lawn care operator. And so there's a lot of things that get done in the interest of efficiency. And because I can't train my people, that really is impactful for the planet. And I think, as a lawn care industry started applying some brain power, to these things, we can make just as much money, probably more, separate ourselves from our competition, and really be a part of an environmental solution. I mean, we'll talk about this more next week, but soil is really the last frontier. We got our oceans, we got our atmospheres. Occasionally we learn something new, but when it comes to soil, even the smartest, most knowledgeable, the most letters behind their name people when it comes to soil will be the first to tell you we know like 5% at best. So as a general rule, if someone stands on a soapbox and tells you they're an expert in soil, dismiss them instantly, because the smartest people I know will start every conversation with, there's still a lot we're learning. I'm no expert. So, we'll get into that more next week, but, it's super, super key that we're dialing in on that.
With that said, I mean, we've gone a little bit long, so I really appreciate everyone hanging in there with us. Any questions? Going once, going twice. Does anyone, Nate, Carl, do you guys want to wrap this up?
I'd like to say one thing. I really appreciate all you, the attendees, taking time out of your evenings after working all day to pay attention to what the future can bring you. Thank you. Thank you for signing up.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. With that said, I'm going to say thank you and good night. I appreciate you all coming out to attend. I want to extend a special thank you to Carl.
Yep.
Salvatore, as we're going to call him from now on.
Yeah, Sal.
The presentation. A lot of great information. I really appreciate that. Barry, as always, just sharing your inputs. And Nate, thank you again for coming in and sharing some of your thoughts. Everybody, have a nice and safe evening. Good night.
Good night.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.